So hello everybody. Welcome to the International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Deely on the 50th anniversary of his passing. And today we have a very special session titled Songbirds of the Primate World. And for this lecture, we have two speakers, Dr. Baranna Baker and Dr. Sofia Berstein. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And also, as the commentators of this lecture, we have here Dr. Susan Mancino. She's present here with us. Thank you, Dr. Mancino, for being here. And I think Dr. Amelia Lewis, later she will write her commentary and we will add it on our website soon. So I will start introducing the lectures and then later after the presentation, I will introduce the commentator, okay? So let me start with Dr. Baranna Baker. Dr. Baranna Baker is an independent scholar who explores semiotics through the lenses of quantum physics and literature. She studied philosophy under the acclaimed semiotician John Deely at the University of St. Thomas, Houston. In her current work, she applies semiotic principles to literature, especially as concern the acts of writing and reading fiction. She also plays with the way the quantum world affects our perceived reality and how that reality can be explained by the interplay of semiotics and quantum physics via the action of science. She has been published in Semiotica, Chinese Semiotic Studies, the American Journal of Semiotics, and Semiotics, the Yearbook of the Semiotic Society of America. She is the associate editor of the latter two works and has, in addition, edited numerous papers, articles, and books relating to the field of semiotics, including proofreading John Deely's book, On the Path of the Sign, Medieval Philosophy Redefined as the Latin Age. Thank you, Dr. Baranna Baker, again. And now I will introduce Dr. Sofia Berstein. After receiving her Master of Sciences degree in Primate Behavior and Ecology from Central Washington University, Sofia Berstein pursued her doctorate at the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Sophia's or Dr. Berstein's dissertation was titled The Vocal Repertoire of Tibetan Macaques in Huangshan, China. Her research was the first to investigate vocalization of this species, and Berstein is considered one of the world's leading experts in Tibetan macaque vocal communication. Dr. Berstein's main research interests include the evolution of acoustic signals, vocal diversity, and communicative complexity by focusing on our closest living relatives from a comparative and multidisciplinary perspective, investigating the evolutionary mechanisms that underpin variation in primate communication can aid in our understanding of one of the most complex puzzles in science, which is the origin and evolution of communication in our own species. Dr. Berstein participates in an ongoing collaboration with Anhui University and Central Washington University at the Valley of Wild Monkeys in China, and also is also a participant of an ongoing collaboration with the Engendered Primate Research Center of Vietnam. Thank you again for being here, and you can start the lecture and the presentation.
Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you, Robert, or William. So just real quickly, for those of you in the audience, this is my first foray into Zoosemiotics, which I never would have attempted without Sophie's expertise. But when I met her, it just seemed like something natural to do. A lot of what I'll be reading is quotations and then some commentary on them, but I wanted to show where we are in the history of thinking. If I miss anything or get anything wrong, please correct me at the end during the commentators. We'll be writing a paper, and I need to know if I haven't gotten something right. So to get started, our topic, we changed the title a little, Songbirds of the Primate Umwelt, a Zoosemiotic analysis of Nomascus Gibbons. I should be able to say them. And we'll get started with that. Okay, the first thing I want to read is a quote from John, because a lot of what we're going to do is actually maybe not question his work at all, but expand on his work, maybe broaden it a little when it comes to semiotic animals. So John says, human beings are semiotic animals precisely because they are the only animals so capable of using signs to be aware that they are signs. The semiotic animal must grasp the difference between related subjectives and the relations themselves. By reason of such an intellectual awareness of the imperceptible being of relations, the semiotic animal can in turn take the relationships themselves and not merely the perceptible related things as foundations for the formation of the Umwelt of yet other relations, what Semiotic so presently termed language in the root sense. The ability cognitively to manipulate relations and their differences from related things, an ability which becomes the species-specific reality of linguistic communication among semiotic animals. So that is John's thought, and the main thing I want to impress there is his belief that we are the only semiotic animals, because that's something we're gonna sort of question. This quote is from D. Abrams, who wrote an absolutely wonderful book about animal communication, and he says, I began to wonder if my culture's assumptions regarding the lack of awareness of other animals was less a product of careful and judicious reasoning than a strange inability to clearly perceive other animals, a real inability to clearly see or focus upon anything outside the realm of human technology, or to hear as meaningful anything other than human speech. And I think that one speaks to itself. And then this is from Radicep and Call. In attempting to define human specificity, what becomes of non-humans in Deely's treatment of man? So that is what we are going to look at. And I want to start by commenting on the anthropocentric mistake, which is something that I truly believe we do with animals. We assume we're the center of the world and that we're superior to all the rest of them. But it's sort of like going to Thailand and having no idea how to read or speak the language. A part of you, of course, doesn't know what's going on, but the other part could even potentially be thinking, do these human beings communicate the same way we do? Are they thinking the same way we do? And that's something that we can not only ask of other cultures, but also, I think, of other species. So Morton says, it's very commonplace to commit the anthropocentric mistake, namely to reason erroneously that human reality is practically all there is. We tend to think in terms of language, and in terms of language, all is yet language. All is human language, therefore all is human. What we do not realize when committing this mistake is that it is not only man who judges, who categorizes, who organizes, and who is different. The anthropocentric, or indeed linguistic mistake, then, consists in mistaking human reality for reality as such. And with this, I'm going to turn it over to Sophie.
And so what I want to do now is to show you how we can make this anthropocentric mistake in analyzing the behavior of primates, so our closest living relatives. So what I want you all to do is look at this image on the screen. We have two primates. We have two monkeys specifically. There's just an image of the face, so that's all we have to read from. And we're limited by just looking at the face to try and understand what they could possibly be emoting from that. So I want you to, in your mind, just assign an emotion to the letter E and the letter F. So hold on to that for a moment, and then we'll take a look at what they actually mean, quote unquote. So what the emotions have been interpreted as. Okay, so take a look at E. What face does that emotion kind of invoke in your memory? And then take a look at F. All right, now let's look at the results. So the face on letter E is actually a friendly affiliative face. And the face in letter F, which might look like a grumpy face or something that might look a little on the angrier side, is actually a neutral face and is not emoting any kind of positive or a negative emotion. It's actually a neutral face. So we can make this same kind of anthropocentric mistake as scientists when we're trying to analyze the behavior of other animals. So we're very limited by our own human perceptions. And in terms of the stuff that I do with looking at bioacoustics and more specifically creating repertoires for particular species, I have to think about my own limits of what I'm doing here. So the reason I do this at all is to establish a terminology for other people to use as a foundation. It's going to aid more comparative studies, and it's helpful for newcomers to a particular species. But some of the classification types that have been considered kind of classic ways of analyzing this within the biology, within the ethology literature, may actually not be appropriate now that we've used more advanced computational methods of analysis. But let's take a look at what they do in the classic literature. So classically in biology, we would classify repertoires as either being graded or discrete. If they're graded, it's really hard to tell between different call types, and they seem to grade into each other. They kind of fade into each other. It's very noisy, it's very messy. And so with these kinds of repertoires, it was believed that as a listener, you couldn't discriminate between call types. So you just had to describe things as best that you could. But those interpretations were descriptive in nature and very subjective. The other kind of repertoires that were said to be discernible by the human ear were said to be discrete. So in this kind of repertoire, this kind of species that you'd be listening to, you could clearly hear distinct call types. And so we could discriminate between them if possible. But the issue arises that if we're just coining communicative complexity on the number of call types, and we're only able to really analyze that in discrete repertoires, we're missing a potentially massive amount of information from repertoires that might actually be more complex because they're graded. But we don't really know. But what we do know presently is that through computational analyses, there might not even be discrete repertoires. There might not be clear distinctions at all, and they might be combined in a more complex manner. So this brings us to a question in my work, and something that we want to hit on today is that we need to have this concept of ecological validity, meaning that we need to think about what's species specific, what makes sense for that species. We need to think about their own realities. We need to think about their perception and how they interact and their physiological capacities for interacting as well. So we're focusing on gibbons. And just to show you a little bit of how the data there is limited, their vocal repertoires, we know that they are capable of emitting really loud calls, but also really soft calls. But within the literature, it looks like all they emit are loud calls, because that's what you can hear when you're standing on the bottom of the forest floor and they're all the way up in the canopy. We can't hear the soft calls at all. So if we're just deciding what the repertoire is based on what we can hear, we're missing a whole world of communication that's just within themselves, within their own private world up there in the canopy.
Their Umwelt.
Yes. And so we see that that has been sort of quantified in a couple species, but there needs to be a lot more work done here. And just to show even further our own limits, if we limit the kinds of microphones that we use, we might not be able to even pick up on any of their calls at all. And what we were able to find within gibbon species is if we adjusted the range, the frequency range, we were able to pick up calls in a lower frequency range. And those were calls that were said to be out of the perception of some of their predators' hearing. And so it would make a lot of sense adaptively to call in those ranges. But if we don't use the right mics, we can't pick that up. And a really extreme example of that is within the Javan slow loris, that image at the very bottom of the slide. We thought that they didn't communicate hardly at all, just through different whistles. But once we started using ultrasonic mics, we realized that they have a very complex communication system. And those studies are only just beginning. So what does communication look like in animals? So far, I've talked about acoustics because that's what I do. Animal signals that are acoustical could include singing behavior, and that's what we'll focus on today with the gibbons. But that is just one type of communication. Animals communicate by actions on the part of one individual, and that informs or alters the behavior of another individual. And those signals can either be chemical in nature, for example, like pheromones, acoustical, like what we're going to focus on today, and visual, to name a few, like the aggressive display you see in the figure on the bottom right of the baboon baring their teeth.
Okay, we're going to go back to a quote by Morton. There are phenomena that cannot best be described in a scientific language. And part of why I chose this quote is to sort of indicate what Sofia and I are trying to do. She's got the scientific language, I've got the semiotic theory, and we're trying to meld those two so that we have zoosemiotics backed up by empirical truth. And part of why we're doing that is we feel like that there are things that are not best described in the scientific language that actually need a perspective such as zoosemiotics or semiotics in general to be properly studied. So Morton says there are phenomena that cannot best be described in a scientific language. The academic genre is given to objectification and might not thus be capable of capturing all phenomena which are not as easily objectifiable. By objectifying subjective phenomena and describing them in scholarly language, we convert them into another genre and consequentially a different mode of being. And this scholarly mode of being is not in all respects true and faithful to the phenomena. In particular, the detachment necessitated by abstract analysis is irreconcilable with full-fledged participation as incarnated, engaged beings on par with other creatures. And so, as I said, that speaks to the fact, and of course you can say semiotics has all sorts of academic language and is definitely of the academic genre, but we're hoping is that by combining the two different perspectives, we can get to a further place than either one has done by itself. And so briefly on the way animals have been treated in philosophical literature. Radicep and Cull say, there are several characteristic ways that animals are commonly discussed in philosophical literature, and they constitute a set of interlinked lines of thinking, the unfortunate consequence of which is the expulsion of animals from philosophy and the reassurance of human uniqueness at the face of the rest of nature. And then this is sort of what we are trying to take this whole discussion with the Gibbons into. Hoffmeyer says biosemiotics does not exclude the traditional methods of biological investigation. Instead, it interprets the meaning of results differently and suggests new experimental settings according to the altered theoretical understanding. Philosophy of science backed up with empirical evidence, which is what it is that we are trying to do. So this is sort of a thesis statement. It is our ongoing intent to begin what will become an ongoing series of zoosemiotic studies of primates, in particular gibbons, in which the structure of the semiotic discipline is merged with and backed up by the empirical evidence of biology. And then from here, we'll move into the concept of there being a theory of mind. Piera Filippi says there are three core abilities that might have grounded a line of phylogenetic continuity between monkeys' communication system and the human language. Syntax, the semantic value of utterances, and the ability to attribute mental states to conspecifics, i.e. the theory of mind. Now he's talking about this as though monkeys and apes' communication systems are an evolutionary step, and we're actually arguing that they're pretty much equal to what we do. Maybe not in as much diversity, but it is too a language.
So something that we discuss a lot in the primatological literature and research is the concept of theory of mind. It's something that people have been looking at for decades across many different species: monkeys, apes, New World, Old World, small-bodied, large-bodied. And so what I wanted to do is kind of show what's been going on in more recent research. So within the primatological community, we have a very similar definition for theory of mind, which is basically just that those that have this are able to have this cognitive ability to understand that others outside of themselves have mental states, that others have beliefs and desires that are different to their own mental state, belief, and desire. And so a more recent study that's been done out of Kyoto University with some of the people that I've collaborated with before is looking at a lot of different species of ape, with bonobos, with chimpanzees, and orangutans. And so this is across many different genera and species. And so this is able to show this within not just the usual suspects of chimpanzees. So are we able to see this in other apes as well? And so what they do is occlude what the actor is able to see. They're able to trace eye gaze in these experiments. They've trained these apes to be able to focus on a screen. They have these really advanced eye gaze technology that they have them wear. And so they're able to look at where the subject is looking. And so what they're doing within this goggle test is having to consult past experiences to determine if the actor that they're watching on screen can accomplish the task. So the whole action of seeing versus not seeing, and attributing that to somebody that they're watching on screen. In terms of Gibbon acoustics and mental representations, the songs that they sing are quite complex, and they're used across many different contexts. One of the contexts being mate choice. So in order to get a mate, you have to first listen for one. And in order to choose one, and this is a monogamous species, which is extremely rare in the primate order. And so that rarity alone just kind of implies how dire and important it is for a gibbon to find their mate. So there's a lot riding on finding who your singing partner is going to be. So the information that's encoded within the songs, so the gibbon is listening to the song, they're able to tell from the singing, so from the song itself, the sex of the individual, their age, their identity, if they're related or not, their location, and potentially their health status, because we know that that is linked to fatigue level, to their hormonal state, to their body size, and even to their dominance rank. And so all of those affect vocalizations, and all of those affect how someone chooses a mate. And we also know that these songs have very specific structures that depend on turn taking. So there's waiting, there's responding that's involved in this duetting behavior. So what I want to do now is play an example of that for you.
It gets louder.
Yep. So there's a lot going on there, right? That's just an example of a pretty simple stereotyped way of them singing. It can be a lot more complex than that, and we'll get into that later.
Hopefully you were able to hear that. We had a problem with the audio. Okay, so now let's go on to something else that John says. For the human mind is like the mind of any other animal in consisting of a modeling system, but it is unlike the mind of any other animal, at least on this planet, in being biologically undetermined in what it models, that is to say, in possessing of language. And again, he says, the linguistic aspect of our objective world appears not only as species specifically human, but also as species specifically natural to the semiotic animals. One of the things that I liked there, that I'm sure he didn't mean in the way that I would love to interpret it, was the plural use of animals, which sort of probably unbidden by him can lead us a little bit into what we're discussing today. Calvi Cole says the key to describing an Umwelt as a whole is the establishment of semiotic operations the organism under study possesses. These are seen as the organizers of the animal Umwelt. They can be used also by researchers as the model builders. Without having a direct access to the Umwelt of another species, we are nevertheless capable of deducing its features on the basis of their organizing principles and the logical operations that species possess.
So that'll take me into introducing to you all what a gibbon is. We've talked about them a little bit, but I want to let you know a little bit more about why they're such an important group of small-bodied apes. So maybe some of you have heard of them before, maybe not. Usually when people think of other apes besides ourselves, we think about chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas, for example. Well, there's a whole other group. They're known as the small-bodied apes. They are members of the superfamily Hominoidea. They did diversify from our own lineage that diverged from Pongidae and Hominidae 17 million years ago. And overall, in the present day, there are 4 genera of gibbons. So each genus is represented below. And we define each genus by the number of chromosomes in their diploid cells. The figure on this slide shows you, with the color-coded here per genus, where they're located in East Asia and Southeast Asia. And so the focus today is going to be on Nomascus, the golden part of the figure here. So that's where we're going to focus our talk on today. We're focusing on the Nomascus genus. So Nomascus gibbons, this happens to be the genus that includes the rarest of the gibbons, of all of them, and they're also the least studied, unfortunately. So what I've done here on this slide is circled the individuals that are included within the studies where we've provided recordings today. And I just want to break down what these red letters mean. So let's start with the blue circle there. That's Nomascus anamensis, and they're considered endangered. And so they are data deficient. That means that we don't have enough data on them. And so it's very uncertain just what their numbers are, but that's usually a sign that they're close to being endangered. If we move down to the brown circle, that's Nomascus siki. They're also included in this study, and they are considered endangered. And then to the left of that, in pink, we have Nomascus leucogenus, and they are critically endangered. And so on the map on the right, you can see where these individuals are, where their ranges are across Vietnam and Laos and further south. So what I want to show you here is something that the gibbons are very famous for. So they're famous for their singing behavior. Besides ourselves in the primate order, they are the most vocally complex. So within the Nomascus genus, if you look to the figure on your right, each of these 4 represents a different species within the genus. And you can see, even if you don't study this, that there are some parts of it that are conserved. Like we can tell that all of these look pretty similar. They're considered the great call, so only females will sing that part of the duet. And this part, in this part of the bracket, the male call, comes afterwards, and there's variation across the genus. And this is the part that the male sings. It's like a coda, and the female and the male do not have any overlap in the notes that they use. So what I want to do now is play a spectrogram with the sound so you can see how the sound moves and looks. So we're going to visualize it for you. So now you can see how we can start to pick apart the different pieces. So one thing that I briefly mentioned on the previous slide is that there isn't really any overlap between the males and the females. There tends to be a sex specificity in their singing behavior, but that's something that tends to be learned over time. So they have to have this period of development with their mothers where they're learning how to sing their sex-specific song. But each song is still going to have an accent to it, their own individual take on it, you can say. So the gibbon songs are not fixed. They're not just born singing all of these songs exactly the way that you just heard them. They're born singing many different kinds of notes. What you see here on the figure at the top, there's a golden figure, that's the adult female, that's the mom, and there's a little black adult male. And so the overlap, the red bracket around them shows that the young adult male is singing some of the female's song notes. So over time, that behavior is going to be teased out, and he's going to learn that he has to sing the male call. So that behavior is something that we only see in super young males if they're raised in the wild. And as you can see in the blue part of the bracket, that's when he becomes an adult. He starts to only sing the male portion of the call. And so young males, their calls can sound a little messy because they're starting to refine it and sing their sex-specific parts. But all of this, like I mentioned before, it needs to take place within that period of development. And so the females are singing ooh notes, barks, and twitters. The males are singing booms, ah notes, and that coda phase that you saw at the end of the female's portion. And so what I want to do now is show you a video of the actual Gibbons singing. And so the black individual here is the male, and the female is the golden individual. And in this species, the females are slightly bigger than the males.
Okay, I want to look here at something I got from on the logic of the animal Umwelten, the animal subjective present and Zoosemiotics of choice and learning, also by Callaway Hall. He breaks down these mechanisms of learning into the first series, which is imprinting an icon, the second step, which is conditioning an index, the third step, which is imitating and what he calls iman, and the fourth step, of which humans are only supposed to be capable of, according to Deely, which is conventioning and symbol, or at least as it applies to language. So imprinting an icon, and I'll go over these quickly. That applies to all life forms. Imprinting is a type of learning in that it is the simplest type of learning and involves one thing standing for another. Iconical signs are what come from it, and they are the most simplistic type of sign, meaning is based on a similarity of physical resemblance, one thing standing for another one thing. An example of this is Warhol's Marilyn for the real Marilyn Monroe. And it involves recognition and classifications and applies to pretty much everything that is living. Conditioning index is a learning system applied to all animals with nervous systems. In conditioning, the two icons are linked, creating a relationship between them. And the link becomes stronger through recognition until the sign becomes conditional to the interpretant. These create indexical signs, which is the linkage between two icons. It's always pointing to something, and it's a correlative relationship between sign vehicle and object signified. An example of this would be a clock pointing to what hour we're in out of any possible 24. Imitating an iman applies to some animals and bird species, certainly the gibbons. Imitation is a form of learning. It requires that a behavior is both perceived in two different ways and repeated by the perceiving organism. This is necessary for social learning. Emonical signs, I'm assuming that's how I could say it, according to Call, refer to the identity between signs. These relate to emotions and empathy, and iman is derived from the Greek word for company. And then we get to conventioning a symbol, which applies to all semiotic animals. Now, conventioning as a form of learning is learning via naming, and it's a capacity to freely combine various signs as standing for other things, such as with language. The symbolic sign refers to linked signs that do not have a shared similarity, but only one based on convention. This allows an interpreter to realize that a sign is actually a sign. So, to me, an example of that is our using words to compose a sentence. They can be linked in any number of different ways to mean any number of different things to a specific interpreter who sees them, whether consciously or not, as a sign. And John says, when it is said that the human mind is capable of grasping the essences of material things, all that is being said is that human mind is ordered to knowing and can come to know the internal composition of its environmental world, but only by observation and patient analysis, trial and error, as it were, and not by intuition of form alone. So I think that's something that Sofia is showing that the Gibbons do as well, and that it's not just purely a human trait. Okay.
So what I want to elaborate now is what I kind of touched on earlier, that they need to have that period of development, that period of learning, to be able to communicate in a way that is showing their sex-specific calling behavior. But what we can see so far with Gibbons is that their communication is not just purely stimulus response. So the Gibbon songs are not fixed themselves. The captive Gibbons, if they're not raised in the wild, if they're raised in captivity, if they're separated from their mothers, if they're separated from other Gibbons and they're raised in isolation, maybe they were pets in the pet trade, maybe they were used in a show or something of that nature. That's the kind of stuff that I've seen at sanctuaries. When they get old enough, they're no longer able to be controlled by the people, and so they drop them off at the sanctuary. And what we see in some of these Gibbons, and it's something that has only been reported in the literature once before, but we know, people who work in sanctuaries know that this happens all the time. It's just not reported as much, is that these captive Gibbons will develop abnormal singing behavior. So we've seen both sides of that coin. We've seen that males will sing female phrases, and that females are also capable of singing male phrases as adults. So we know that when they're young, they go through that period of development. They learn their sex-specific songs. If that doesn't happen, it's a complete mess. And so what you see here on the figure is where a female is singing boom and staccato phases, which are supposed to only be male notes. So if we looked at her calling behavior compared to what's pretty typical for a female sex-specific calling pattern, it wouldn't look anything like this. It wouldn't even have these notes. And we found something similar with the Gibbons that we studied in Vietnam. We saw that there was a male who had been raised in isolation, was brought to the center, who was only singing the female song. He wasn't singing any of the male notes.
Okay, I want to talk about the terminological distinction between two types of language. And this is according, again, to Filippi. He speaks of language in the broad sense as a general biological tool that allows for communication and refers to the ability to produce a visual and or acoustic sign in association with a specific referential object. And this is possessed by all animals. And then the second type he speaks of is the ability to speak and understand a natural language following specific combinatorial and morphosyntactical rules as species specific to human. Well, what we are arguing is that this is not only species specific to human, that with these songs, the Gibbons are doing the same sort of thing, that it's a natural language and that it is very specific in certain ways in its rules.
So let's move to how they are specific and look at the evolutionary roots of language in non-human primates. So one thing I mentioned earlier about the Gibbons in general, besides ourselves within the primates, they're the most vocally complex. And so it's pretty important that if we're trying to look for these evolutionary roots, we look at our closest living relatives and we focus on the ones that are the most complex besides ourselves. So Gibbons are kind of a natural species that you'd want to study, but they're very difficult to study in the wild. So the literature on them is quite sparse. But one thing that we do see is that we can find a kind of syntax within the songs, within the way that they organize their notes in that order, and that's linked with different contexts. And we can see that they are using these songs in situations where there might be a predator, but every single time that they sing, there's not a predator around. So there are distinctions between the way that the songs are formed in response to a predator versus a context where there's no threat at all. And so the study here is showing how, with a playback experiment, they can tease apart the context. So what they did was they had predator models and they recorded the songs that were made towards that predator, compared them to the songs they sang every morning, and they were able to find these patterns. And so I know this looks pretty complex here on the right, but I can break this down. So on the left here, these are duet songs. And so these are the different colored codes for the different notes. And you can easily tell just between how this isn't all the same, that there are patterns that are different between where there's a predator around and when they're just duetting. So when they're duetting, there's a bit more complexity there. They're using more leaning wah notes. Those leaning wah notes are not ordered in the same way, and they're not as frequently used as they are within a predator context. So just within these two contexts, we can see differences, but we know that they sing across an even wider variety. So we need to keep doing these fine-tuned analyses of their syntax to reveal just how complex these songs really are. And so that leads me to, why do Gibbons even sing? One of the things we talked about before was mate attraction, but they also use it in a defensive way to defend their territory. There's an entire hypothesis that's focused on the development of singing from a territorial behavior perspective. As I mentioned before, these are monogamous apes. They are one of very, very few examples within the primates. And so this singing behavior is a way to advertise that pair bond between mated individuals who are going to stay together for life. It also, each song is specific to that individual. You can think of it as a vocal fingerprint. So that is something that's communicated as well within the song. And another thing that we see is that there's a genetic component. The different the different species within the genus Nomascus have different stylized songs, different kinds of notes. Follows a similar pattern, but there are slight changes between the species. And we also see that there's a learning aspect, something we touched on prior, if they are able to develop and have that period with their mother in the wild, they can have their sex-specific songs. In captivity, that's not always going to be the case. But we can't rule out that they might just be singing for fun. So the loud calls, these songs, you're hearing them when you're on the forest floor. They're up in the canopy, way, way up above you. And these calls can travel quite a ways. They're extremely loud. And so when we think about why an animal is producing such a loud call that could come at a pretty big energetic cost, one thing that we talk about in the biological literature is that it might be considered an honest signal. It might be something that indicates that individual's resource holding potential. And what does that mean? Well, it means that the acoustics themselves are encoded with information about the body size of the individual. There's a relationship between the size of the body and your frequency range for us as well. There's influences on acoustics in terms of age, the rank, the dominance rank, and that can influence the hormonal state of the individual. That can affect singing behavior and frequency range behavior, acoustic behavior, and also the fatigue level, how tired they are. So all of this information is extremely important for someone who's prospectively looking for a potential mate. There have been studies looking at this connection between calling behavior and resource holding potential of calling behavior and these honest signals. And we know that these great calls, the calls you heard earlier, they really push their females to the limit. Think of like an opera singer. They're really pushing themselves to their physical limit. And so that's something that we were able to find within the Gibbons in Vietnam as well. We ran similar studies looking at all of these different measurements that we were able to acquire from the vets on site. And we looked at that in association with acoustic parameters. So the different specific fine-tuned analyses of the acoustics and how that relates to all of these pieces, their body size, their health overall. And so one thing that I want to stress too is that this is something that is a learned behavior. It's not just, they're not just singing random notes at random intervals, stimulus response, they see a predator, they just sing. There's something more fine-tuned there. There's learning that goes into it because they're not singing whatever song. There's context-specific songs. And so those mother-daughter interactions are vital. And what you see here on the figure is how their singing behavior starts to match over time as the daughters get older, as they have more practice, as they learn how to sing from their mothers. And so you can hear what are known as intergenerational duets. So it's not just duetting behavior between males and females. You also have mothers and daughters learning how to sing. And that behavior decreases over time as they get older and they have started to learn their appropriate sex-specific songs. One thing that's really important about this, though, is as they're learning how to match their mothers, what we mean by that is that they have to have very flexible vocals to acoustically match her. So they're trying to find, like if you're singing and you're joining in a choir, trying to find the right pitch, trying to be in tune with everybody else. It's a little bit of that. So doing that implies that there's short-term, at least, vocal flexibility, and it's not just something that is automated. There's some kind of mediation there. And we also see that the mothers, when they're trying to teach their daughters, their songs are going to be on the simple side. They're going to be that very stereotyped pattern of the right order of notes within each phrase. But that changes depending on their audience. If they're not trying to teach their daughters, if they're trying to sing with their mate, their companion, then their songs are going to be more complex. So the effect of the audience can influence the acoustics as well. What I want to do now is review the way that we see syntax across the primate order. So not just in gibbons, in monkeys and other apes as well. So I'm going to start with the least complex types of syntax in primates, and then I'll lead up to the most complex, those hierarchical structures. The simplest types are called merged units. So that's where these callers are combining vocal structures. And they might do that to convey their ID or information about a particular event. And that's kind of the simplest way that they're able to combine sounds at a very minute level to show like context specificity, for example. We see that in a few different species. Something that's a little bit more complex, but not quite at the call sequence level, is something called suffixation. So the figure on your top right, at the top left-hand corner, there's a hawk call. Top right row, there's a crack call. So they can add a suffix to that oo part to it, and that's going to change what the audience is going to be able to interpret. So when they add that oo to their alarm call, it indicates that the danger is non-urgent, so there's not a threat. So adding that suffix is extremely important for that listener to interpret. Getting to the more complex sequence level stuff, though, where we start to see like what the Gibbons are doing, where they're combining different notes to create something much larger overall. We can see permutations. So there are ordered ways that the call is delivered. So alarm calling behavior, we see that in many different species of monkeys. One really impressive example that's been analyzed in extreme depth is the chimpanzee pant hoot. And so this type of calling, once the chimpanzee starts panting and going into this hooting, they can't stop. They go through this kind of really long song, I guess you could say. And that's what you see here in the figure on the bottom. And so each part of that song is associated with a different type of information. So the first part of information, if you're listening to the pant hoot, you start hearing them panting. The first part is telling you the identity of that chimpanzee. The next part is going to start talking about a little bit of the age of the individual. And then you get into social status. And then finally, the context. Is this a fight? Is this a non-threatening situation? All of this information flows within that combination, within the delivery of that call. At the peak, though, I guess, in terms of complexity, we have what are known as hierarchical structures. And so this is where we see that meaning can be conveyed through utterances, so these signals that might be different in how long they are and how they're assembled into much more complex sequences. And this is something that we don't just see in apes. We see this in different monkey species as well. This leads us to a question of event perception and syntax. So one thing that I wanted to include here, a quote from Zoosemiotic, someone who's done a lot of this kind of work in the field with playback experiments, looking at syntax. They're noticing that syntax is linked to how events in the external world are perceived, how they're structured and mentally represented. And they noticed through these analyses that we're splitting events into actors, into actions and patients. And we're linking between components of natural events. And there's this kind of flow with how natural events occur and the grammatical functions of our own language. So there's that link there, the kinds of patterns that are inherent within our grammatical structures. And we tend to see some examples in the primate literature. So Zoosemiotic touches on one particular example in chimpanzee screams, that individuals can discriminate between scream types. So they can tell from the scream if it's coming from somebody who is the aggressor or the individual who's screaming out of defense. So chimpanzees will scream in both contexts. So they're able to discern between the actor versus the patient. So one thing that we're discussing here is that if chimpanzee screams can be discerned depending on their acoustics, their fine-tuned things that the listeners can hear, and those contexts, we can see that in gibbon mother-daughter singing as well, and other more complex singing behavior between males and females.
Okay, so we're going to conclude this now by reading from Arnold and Zuberbuehler, who say, we conclude that, contrary to current theory, meaningful combinatorial signals have evolved in primate communication. And so here we can see somebody from the biology world who has studied these primates extensively, calling for the same thing that we are hoping to do with more semiotic content in a paper that we will base on this lecture. And this is Radicep and Call. All species partake in a multitude of sign types simultaneously and or conceptually. In this case, no unique lower-higher access can exist. To emphasize this plurality, the term semiotic species instead of semiotic animal may be used, and that is definitely something we are rallying for, is to try to find some proof for that, and see where this leads us. And so this is our call for action. We both of us hope that this presentation has created an interest in Gibbons within the semiotic and scientific communities, enough so that it is clear that further research is needed. But in order to allow future studies of the Gibbons, these endangered animals must be brought back from the verge of extinction, both within the wild and in sanctuaries dedicated to their survival and study. In order for these conservation efforts to be successful, please consider donating to the following charities, if at all possible.
So one thing I want to mention here very quickly, one of the individuals that has been a really big collaborator for me was actually my first graduate student, Caroline Rowley, and I want to thank her for having this passion for bioacoustics and looking at health as well. And so this was a project that we are continuing to work on. That's an image of her in Vietnam recording the gibbons from this lecture. All these images that you've seen in this lecture are gibbons from the centers that she and I went to. So she went to the Endangered Primate Rescue Center in Vietnam and the Gibbon Conservation Center. And so I actually taught her how to record here. This is a really special place here in the United States. It's a nonprofit center. It promotes conservation study, and they are extremely amazing caretakers of the gibbons they have there. They do a lot of public education outreach, and they also preserve habitats of gibbons worldwide. They are an incredible organization. You can actually visit if you're ever in Santa Clarita. I highly recommend it. And what's really special about this place is that there's no other place in the world where you can see as many species of these extremely rare endangered gibbons in one location. And so some of the studies that we're proposing to do, I think we could actually do with captive gibbons. They don't have to necessarily be in the wild. We could explore those soft calls. We're going to be able to get close enough to them to look at some of this stuff. And it would help these gibbons as well in the long run, which is something that's very near and dear to my heart. And I also want to thank the Endangered Primate Rescue Center, where we were able to do these health and acoustic experiments. My student was the director of the center for a few years. The center's in Vietnam and Cuc Phuong National Park. It's been going on for some time, since 1993. It's a sanctuary, so they're also conserving primates. There are species there that they take care of that nobody else is able to handle and take care of, because they're in a very limited field range that's only on this site. So it's a very important place as well for species diversity. And they have an incredible array of primates, langurs, gibbons, and loris as well.
And then finally, we couldn't have done any of this without John's brilliant thinking on the topic of what it is that makes the semiotic animal in the first place. And he was such an animal lover himself that I can't help but think that he would be pleased to see that his work might have been is being extended in this way. Thank you, John. We miss you. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you.
How do we get that?
Thank you so much, Dr. Baranna Baker and Dr. Sofia Berstein. Thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. So now I will invite Dr. Susan Mancino to share with us her thoughts. But first, let me say that we invited Dr. Amelia Lewis. She accepted to be another commentator for this presentation, but unfortunately she wasn't able to participate here. But she will write a commentary, and as soon as we have it, we will add it to our website. So Dr. Amelia Lewis, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. But I will invite Dr. Susan Mancino because she's here. But first, let me introduce her. Dr. Susan Mancino is assistant professor at St. Mary's College in the United States. Dr. Mancino received her Master of Arts and PhD from Duquesne University. Her areas of expertise are philosophy of communication, communication ethics, and semiotics. Apart from having published under premium labels such as Etudes Hicoier Studies, Communication Research Trends in the International Journal of Listening. Apart that, she's also a co-editor of an encyclopedia of communication ethics, Goods in Contention, and also Communication and Learning in an Age of Digital Transformation. Dr. Mancino, thank you for accepting our invitation, and you are free to share with us your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this, and thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It's really has been interesting. I was taking notes the entire way through and have several pages of notes. My background in semiotics is primarily coming from studies from ECHO, although I am a fan of John Deely's work and familiar with it as well. More so than suggestions or anything like that, I have questions that I would love to hear you talk more about. And the first is thinking about how you began your presentation talking about Deely's work on describing humans as semiotic animals and our ability to understand and be aware that we are using signs. And this happens in the production of us like creating signs, using signs, and being aware of that, as well as on the interpretation end of that exchange. And it seemed to me that your study was, in terms of the songs, is really looking at the way in which there is an awareness of signs and ability to use and manipulate those signs in those duets. But I was interested in hearing more about if you see connections or if you're aware of any connections and what happens on the interpretation end of this exchange as semiotic animal, semiotic practice. I'm thinking about sort of like if you're interested in dating someone and they send you a message and you talk to your friends about like, what does this mean? Is that type of ambiguity and discernment happening in these duets, or is what's happening on the interpretation end of that exchange?
So a lot of it is, so the songs are being emitted at certain times of the day, usually in the mornings. So think about like you're getting up, you're trying to, you're a young female gibbon and you're out there trying to find your mate. You're listening for different songs in the morning. And so you start hearing like all this different kind of singing. And then you start to hear a song from a particular male that sounds like maybe they're the same age as you. Maybe they sound healthy in some way. Maybe they have a song type that is particularly attractive to you. Some of this has been like in terms of like attractiveness has been defined in terms of like how related they are. So songs that are played that are from related individuals are not going to be as like attuned to as they are from songs that are played back from unrelated individuals, because it's a lot more interesting to listen for songs from somebody that you're not related to. So you have to be able to tell who that individual is. So if it's a brand new individual, you're going to listen for that specifically, and you're going to try and pick apart what you can from it to decide if you want to sing back. And then once you start doing that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be mated. That just means that you're in that phase of like trying to see if you fit together well. If they're able to like not synchronize, but if their singing behavior, if they like to do it together, if they continue to do it together, if we see that frequency increase, and from there they might start to create that mated pair.
And also from the semiotic perspective, there's so much still that needs to be studied, and I think the gibbons are a very appropriate species because of their wide range of vocalizations. But in order for intent and receiver perception to truly be understood, I think we have to touch the iceberg, tip of the iceberg, as to what sorts of things need to be studied even further that would push for further and maybe different field work that has been done.
I think playback experiments could maybe tease apart why they decide to call back, like what needs to be said in the call for them to actually respond.
Thank you for your
question.
Thank you. My next question was thinking about the vocal complexity, which you included throughout the entire presentation, and emphasized that the gibbons is, I guess, one of the most vocally complex animals after humans. And you also talked a lot about how these songs are learned. And I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about that, thinking about that in kind of comparison or relationship to the way that human children learn language. And like, is a gibbon born with us like singing? And I mean, because like, humans aren't born making sort of like consonant sounds. It takes several months before. So how does that happen? And I know that you mentioned like in mother-daughter, these intergenerational songs, that they're also cross-sex intergenerational songs where a mother and her son is singing. What happens in that regard, and what might that tell us about the learning of the linguistic and semiotic system as well?
Right. Yeah. Very good question. So it seems like if the songs are just stimulus responsive, they're fixed, then they should be born with all the notes within their sex-specific song repertoire. But they actually are able to, like we see in the super young gibbons, that it's a little bit messy, kind of like human babbling, not quite on par with that, but where the sounds are there, but they're starting to get fine-tuned into words. And so they're have, I guess, messy singing. They're singing male notes and female notes when they're really young. These are like baby gibbons. And so they're singing like kind of a messy cross-sex combination of song notes within that early singing behavior. But then by singing with their mother, and the mother like repeating like the notes that is specific for that sex. So that's for the daughter, right? So then you have the fathers and the sons. But that hasn't been studied and recorded. So I hesitate to like discuss it as much because the mother-daughter relationships have been very well studied. So there's a lot more that needs to be done here. But what I can say between mothers and daughters is that the mother starts to sing, okay, these are the 3 phrases. I'm going to sing really simple versions of each one over and over again. The daughter's going to try and match me in some way. If she can't, then we'll keep doing it. But then over time, the mother starts to sing more complex. She's not singing a super stereotyped way. And so the daughter is able to kind of start elaborating on hers too. And so it becomes a lot more like a vocal fingerprint instead of just like singing the exact same notes in the same order and as many notes per section. Does that make sense? It gets fine-tuned over time.
And then my third question was thinking about, I guess, going again off of the complexity of this and thinking about that early distinction about the sort of graded discrimination of hearing the difference between those sounds, and thinking about that as a possible connection to like an excess of information, and maybe in like this cybernetic view of noise and how that excess of information brings forth ambiguity, and how that's happening when we look at Gibbons. But there's also sort of our inability, which you began with our anthropocentric mistake of missing information, of not having access to that, almost like not being able to perceive that, and thinking of it almost as a lack of noise or a lack of something that we're able to perceive it and find meaning within. And I was just interested in hearing more about that, about how the excess of information and excess of signs could be directing this anthropocentric mistake, and what your thoughts are in that regard.
Yeah, I think that with each of these studies, it has to be species specific. You have to consider first, like, what the frequency range is for them. And if it's even acoustic, it might not be. It might be gestural as well. So there are some studies in chimpanzees, and I would argue gibbons use gestures too. It's just not documented. But when they're singing, one thing that you'll notice is that they're like moving their bodies in specific ways for certain parts of the song. And some of it might be to amplify some of those notes, like when you move your body, if you're going like a woo versus just sitting in one place going woo. These kinds of things are part of it. So there's that gestural and vocal combinatorial sequential part that could be there as well. But it all depends at the species level.
I also think it's very important to put some perspective on this by comparisons. I gave the example of going to Thailand and spending a month there, and my daughter had to translate the whole time. I had no idea what was being said. That did not indicate that the people there do not think as semiotically as we do, that they do not have consciousness of using signs. Their signs are just different from mine. I can't understand them. Whereas if I go to France and visit Andre at his ancestral home, well, I've lived in France for a while. It's been a very long time, but I can pick up words. I can understand basic ideas. Now, if he gets into a philosophical discussion with a bunch of compatriots, then I'm going to be lost, in all honesty. My French is just not that good anymore. I don't know that it was ever that good. But I understand enough of it to know that he is thinking abstractly, semiotically, attributing this thought process to what he is saying and then listening to the response. And I just really, to me, the whole anthropocentric mistake has to do with us potentially treating it as though it isn't a language. Maybe we'll study this and find that there's something that makes it invalid to call them semiotic animals, but I really don't think that's going to be the case. I think we don't understand what they're saying, and we certainly can't get inside their minds to figure out what they are perceiving or thinking about.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I learned a lot from it. I want to make sure there's some time to hear from other participants who are here. I know that Elma asked a question in the chat. I don't know if you've seen that, and we're going to respond to that as well. But
Okay, thank you.
There are two.
Allow me to, we will close the broadcast on YouTube now, but of course we can have this dialogue with the audience present here. Yeah, and yes, Elma wrote a question here, but I think we can address Elma's question later, because I think she will be back here. She sent me a message saying that she will try to be back. So if she be back, we can answer her question. But I think Dr. Andre wants to speak. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you for this, because I will not be able to stay that long. I have other things to do. So I want to have this advantage to now ask my questions. And I first want to thank both Baranna and Sofia for the magnificent duet. So there are all kinds of things that could be asked, and I will confine myself to something that is of great importance, because you began with this a kind of the paradigmatic distinction that John Deely made between the human species and every other species, which is really the human's capacity to talk about talk, the language about language. So he would be fine with the idea that most other species have their own ways of communicating in all kinds of ways, but they are not aware, he says, that they are using signs. But what I am learning in this wonderful presentation is that when you consider the complexity of Gibbons vocalization, and even the capacity for researchers to at least make those claims that it is possible by to those acoustic studies to distinguish different patterns in succession, and even to ascribe to them certain different functions, like the expression of their own identity, of their dominance, and their social status, and so on. That I mean, I suppose it would be. I would be interested to know how that translation was. How is it that such a translation could be reached? But aside from that, it is that there is an important inference to be made here, is that Gibbons, in the process of learning, they are learning to do those sounds syntactically, but also on the pitch side correctly, which means that the species has a huge interest in getting this right.
Mm-hmm.
The concern to get it right really means what? That in the process of semiotization, there is a need, an understood need, that the message has to be sent right to the right audience. So there is a great care about the continuity of the interpretants in Persian terms, that the utterers are very much aware that this is destined to be interpreted by others. And that matters a great deal, not only for the current conversation, but for the survival of the species in the context in which they are, and so on. So that if I suppose if a young one makes a mistake, somehow it will be conveyed to the young ones, not good enough yet.
Yeah.
But that would indicate then that they are very much aware of uttering signs.
That's my feeling as well, Andre. I think there are certain things that they are doing. Like I said, we cannot get inside their consciousness and understand if they are manipulating them consciously, in the sense that John levels it up with the idea of semiotic animal. But by the same token, there are, people in general all over the world who use signs every minute of the day with absolutely no idea that they are using signs. So I question that part of the definition, in that I think it even excludes a number of human beings. Obviously not us, but there's a lot of people out there that, I try to explain to them what a sign means semiotically, and it's like this whole complex conversation, and they're scratching their heads afterwards. So I think we have to be careful with that. However, I do think that their use of language to communicate, and the necessity for the young ones to learn that language and what they are communicating does speak to the fact that there is a conscious mind that is aware of itself and what it is doing.
I agree with this, especially because it is not necessary to know semiotics.
Right.
So some kind of very vague theory about it. You don't need to call a pattern by a name like a sign or a symbol and so on. What matters is that to the animal, there is this experience of the third, in the third sense, the experience of the patternization of those signs. And the pattern is really a legisign. And the legisign governs really the semiosis itself. It is that sensitivity to the thirds that bring them then to sort of assess without saying so, there is a law here. And we better get the young ones to feel that same law so that we are all in sync.
Exactly.
And what we are doing as human beings is, there's a pattern to the pattern.
Yeah.
But it's the same logic. We are capable of, let's translate this pattern into something else, like a second intentional consideration of it that becomes then some kind of jargon, some kind of vocabulary that allows us then to talk about the topic from that standpoint. But I think the logical process remains identical. It may well be that after zillions of years, Gibbons are going to evolve this if we let them alive, and they will send researchers to study the human species. But the other
Or
thing
we learn how
is
to
that
translate their language and realize that they are more profound than we are.
well, I suppose that most species would not, let's say, be able to prevent this kind of evolution from happening under certain circumstances, because the circumstances are going to bring this on. Part of the reason is that when we talk about Umwelt, it is species-specific Umwelt. Peirce's word for Umwelt is really Phenomenology. It does exactly the same thing, but it is for more fundamental, because it is the Umwelt of all possible Umwelts. You can turn the phenomenon is that which is necessary for anything alive to actually just bask in the perceiving of things. But Peirce's idea is that it is out of the phenomenon that semiotization comes. The continuum of semiosis emerges from the infinite and infinitely rich continuum of the phenomenon. But out of it, patterns are going to emerge. And those patterns are going very much to decide how to make sense of this environment that we are in. And animals are likely to be far more into and with the environment than we are. But that it is really inescapable for semiotization to occur as an experience in anything that is alive.
Agreed. We will be writing up a paper, and Calabi Cull has agreed to look at it before we publish. I would love to send it your way as well, Andre.
Well, thank you. I'm getting messages that I have to go.
Bye. So good
Thank
to
you
see
for
you.